I'm Karen Waldron. I teach literature and writing at the college. And before I introduce Roxana, I just want to mention that Blake Davis, who is a student of mine right here, is going to pitch in a little bit in the conversation because we've asked him to, and because he's an example of what we're trying to inspire. And now, without any further ado, Roxana Robinson, you all know, I'm sure this is somewhere here, is an acclaimed author. She has won a Guggenheim Fellowship. She has published in the New Yorker, in the New York Times, and the Atlantic. She is the author of 8 books, including a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. She has written several novels. She has an exquisite attention to detail. In addition, she's of great service to the writing community. She has served as a member of the PEN board, the American Writers Center, and has just contributed enormously to writing for this country and its culture of writing. So I'm sure most of you want to hear from her about her writing and what inspires her, so I thought I would start by asking a question, if that's all right, which is, what inspires you most to write, both in terms of the writers that you've loved and the writers that you've always admired, and how you keep the inspiration flowing once you've exhausted a theme?
It's a really good question, and one that all writers love is sort of, who are your heroes? Who was it that first drew you into that stream, that brilliant, lucid surge that writing is? And for me, I was thinking about it in preparation for this. When I was little, I was horse crazy. That doesn't seem to exist much anymore, but when I was growing up, girls were horse crazy, and it meant that you actively were a horse, or you rode horses, or you thought about horses. I had a horse phone, requested horses. I played horses at recess. I rode horses when my parents finally allowed me to have one. And I read every book I could find about horses, and one of the books that I read was National Velvet by Bagnall, which is an exquisitely beautiful piece of writing. She was actually a wonderful writer. And so for a 12-year-old, reading these beautifully elegant sentences about something that I loved allowed me to absorb the beauty of writing in a way that was invisible to me. I didn't I had no idea that this was what was happening, but I remember reading a sentence out loud to my mother and saying, "Isn't this beautiful?" And the sentence was something like, it's set in the South Downs in England, and the Downs are these beautiful treeless hills that slope down towards the sea, and it was the Downs sloped down like grazing beasts. So there was this beautiful metaphor and the sense of the natural world, but it was really the beauty of the language that struck me. So that all those writers that I read as a young girl, Jane Eyre, of course, and it was English writers, so that I felt as if I was sort of part of a long Anglo-American line of people. Jane Austen and the Brontes, and Virginia Woolf, and William Trevor, and Henry Green, and Rosamund Lehman, and somebody else like William Trevor, V.S. Pritchett, and then, of course, Updike, who was the great American proponent of that style, of meticulous attention to detail, Elizabeth Bowen and Elizabeth Taylor, great English writers. Attention to detail and great sensitivity and conviction, absorption in the domestic drama, the belief that the domestic drama is really the great drama. That's really where the great things that happen to us take place. And that's what Shakespeare knew. And so he made his great, his protagonists, his heroes, into kings and princes, so that whatever happened to them happened to the entire country. But in fact, the dramas are domestic. They're about husbands and wives and children and lovers. That's where the heat is. So I loved those writers because they dealt with this intensely personal private drama, and they illuminated it in a way that meant that anyone could enter it and that it could become universal. And so they created this intense, small, poetic core that could become something that lights up the world.
When did you said at first it was invisible? By the way, I hope others will participate in the conversation. Feel free to ask up, louder. Okay. Feel free to.
Or can anybody move closer?
Yeah.
Is there room for people to come in?
Yeah. There's room in here. There's people like to come in and be closer to our voices, and we'll try to project a little more as well. But I wanted to invite anybody who has a question from the audience, please, to ask their questions. Don't let me be the only one.
Which book were you talking about reading?
Oh, Enid Bagnall's National Velvet, which is a very beautiful book.
I think, by the way, I think girls still love horses.
Yes.
We have some people with daughters in the room who have had the experience quite recently. No, you had said that originally the feeling of that sort of passionate power of language was invisible to you. Can you talk about when it became conscious, or how it became conscious, and how you started to think, this is something I also would like to do, or this is something I also could do?
It's funny, people always say, when did you start writing? And my answer is, I started writing when you started writing in first grade. We all start writing at the same time. It's just that writers keep going, and it becomes something that's part of your life. And because writing was such a big part of what I did, and in second grade I wrote a class paper called The Daily Nut, written by Squirrel. It never occurred to me, it was like breathing, it was just something that I did, or walking. And it never occurred to me that it wasn't the same for everybody else. It's like being colorblind. You don't know if you are because you don't know what other people see. And I remember reading, we were asked to write journals when I was in 11th grade. And I was reading a passage that I'd written to my roommate. It was about the snow. It was snowing and it was dark. And I finished reading it and she said, I wish I could write like that. And I thought, but you can't. I mean, it's just putting, you can. Just write it, just put it down. And it was clear that she didn't feel that way. So that was sort of a moment in which I thought, okay, whatever's happening is different for me. It's something that I'm in touch with, that not necessarily everybody else is. And also teachers were always saying, oh, you should do more of this, you should. And I was somewhat resistant, so every time a teacher told me to write more, I would write less. But it became apparent, I think, when I was in boarding school, that this was a current in my life that was going to change it.
That rebellious spirit, I really appreciate that. You're thinking about that too.
Very much.
You were talking about exquisite detail, that you were really attracted to exquisite detail and how it makes a scene or makes a domestic drama palpable to the reader. And we had talked about that a little bit, but why? Well, first of all, how do you do it? And I know that that's an impossible question, but I think people would really like to hear, how do you do it? How do you know that you've got the words that are going to have the kind of effect that you most admire and are aiming for? And why does it matter? Why does this word over another word matter so much? How do you discern that?
Well, I think there are two things here. One is, how do you create the detail, the telling detail? And that has to do with perception, I think. And the way we experience a moment of great stress or pathos or delight, the way we experience it takes place in our sensory apparatus. So you will remember the moment that you first heard about 9/11. You'll remember where you were, and you'll remember what you were looking at. And you might remember a smell that were particularly pervasive at that moment. But the way that moment becomes solidified in your memory is through your senses. So particularly what you see is crucial and essential. So that if you're setting a scene and you want the scene to deliver a particular mood, you describe what the character is seeing. And the way you describe that scene informs us about the mood. So if the character wakes up depressed and it's a beautiful day with the sun shining on the water, you describe that sun shining as being flat and glaring and it's too hot, and his sheet was pulled over his mouth during the night and he can't quite breathe through his mouth. And so you describe a situation even though the weather is beautiful and he's in a beautiful room. You make it clear that he's having a horrible time, even through this. So that so you do it through the filter of the protagonist's sensory apparatus. That's the way you deliver the emotional presence in that. As to the words, how do you choose the right words? When I teach, I tell my students that the way to learn to write is by reading great writers, and that's what you do. You read beautiful sentences, and that's what literary writers try to do, is we try to write beautiful sentences. There's a famous quote by Flaubert in which he's a wonderful letter writer, and he was asked what he was doing, and he said he spent all morning yesterday, adding one word to a paragraph. And he said, and today I spent all morning taking it out. And every writer understands that. We all love that quote because it makes us feel as if what we do is in some way valid. So that there is this sense, and I tell my students, you must, writing should be, I tell them that a short story is like a fish. The curve of it must be perfect. A short story must be perfect. A novel is never perfect, but a short story must be perfect. And the curve of it, the movement of it has to be flawless. There are no digressions, there are no interruptions. The curve is perfect. And every word and every sentence is like the overlapping scale. So each word must be connected to the word next to it, and each sentence folds into the sentence before it. So it flows without interruption and without any kind of change. So how do you choose the right word? It has to do with the rhythm of the sentence. You don't want to use 3 polysyllabic words in a row. You don't want to use to alliterate unless you intend to, unless that means something there. If you use a short sentence here, you don't want a series of short sentences unless you're trying to be Hemingway. All of those things are part of the beautiful intensity and struggle of writing. And it's a great pleasure as well as struggle to deal with those issues, and that's what you do all day long, hour after hour, week after week. That's how you spend your whole life, is struggling with the shapes of words and how they're going to make a beautiful sentence and a beautiful paragraph. Great question.
Along these same lines, and using your very good novel Cost as an example, could you tell us how in what order, before you came to the writing, the characters occurred to you? If you knew you were going to write about heroin addiction, how did you decide and put it in a family setting? How did you put the characters in, and then I suppose the scenes came after that, but maybe not. Could you tell us?
It's a question I'm often asked, and it's a very revealing. The answer is very revealing about the way I work. So I'm glad you asked it. So I did not start out to write about heroin. I started out to write that novel because I was interested in a question, and the reason I write novels is because some issue that I don't understand, that I can't figure out, presents itself to me, and it's something that I need to write in order to understand. So the question that appeared to me was the problem of how difficult it is to be a good adult child. And the sense was that no matter, that you have this feeling when you're growing up, that it's you don't get along with your parents at times, sometimes you do, but you have this feeling, or you may have this feeling that at some point in your life, you will be a grown-up, they will be grown-ups, and you will be on an equal playing field, and you will be friends and colleagues and equals. But it seems that, maybe some of you have already thought of this, it seems that that never happens. That no matter how old you are, when you are in the presence of your parents, you can open your mouth and you will hear the voice of a spoiled 6-year-old, or a whiny, rebellious 15-year-old, or a very superior 21-year-old. And you are saying, how can I be saying these things? I'm whatever age I am. I'm 47. I have 2 teenagers. I'm a grown-up, and I'm talking like a spoiled child to my parent who loves me and who has done her best to make me into a normal human being, and turns out I'm not. So I was interested in this question, and so I wanted to write about somebody who's in the middle of her life. That's the main character, Julia, and has 2 kids in their 20s, and parents in their late 80s, and how she's struggling. They're visiting her, and she wants them to be happy, and she finds herself being a bad child. And why is she doing this? So that was the initial impetus. I also wanted to try something new in terms of formal technique. I wanted to enter into everybody's mind, and I had done that in an earlier book, but only in sections. So This Is My Daughter, one section is one person's mind, and there are 3 sections. But in this, I wanted everybody's mind to be present all the time, and that's very demanding technically, because you never want the reader to be confused. So you have to get everybody on the page very clearly, so the reader will always know whose mind you're in and what their point of view will be. So I was dealing with that, and I was also interested in the aging parents, and they are in their late 80s, and they're reaching a point at which they're starting to lose their grips on the world for different reasons. The father is finding physically he can't, and he was a neurosurgeon, so he's been used to being able to do very delicate things, and now his hands are like mitts, they're like paws, and he's a bit lame, and he's always been very demanding and imperious, and he has a hard time admitting to his daughter what's happening, and the mother is starting to lose her memory. So I was interested in what happens to the parents when they start losing the power that they used to have, and how that affects their relationships with the daughter. And are they frightened? Do they tell her? Do they conceal it from her? Does it make her feel, might it make her feel angry that she's being abandoned by the people who always protected her? So I was interested in this complexity that was going on between the daughter and the parents. Then, as I was exploring each mind, and as I was in the mind of Stephen, I'm writing the first chapter. Stephen's the older son. He's on his way up to visit his mother and her parents in Maine, in their house in Maine, and he's remembering. He knows that his mother is going to say, "Have you seen the younger brother Jack?" He has seen the younger brother Jack, and he's remembering his visit to Jack. And during his remembering, it became apparent to me, to my horror, that Jack was a heroin addict. So I had thought I was going to write this very quiet, interior, domestic novel, just about parents and children, and all of a sudden, it's about heroin and addiction and chemistry and policemen and lying and stealing and an incredibly different kind of world, people living on the edge. So that was horrifying because I didn't know anything about that world, and it changed the it changed the pattern of the book, the trajectory of the book, and it meant I had to do another 2 or 3 years of research. But I do that as I write the book, so I was exploring that as I was writing. That sort of gets folded in, and as I got to a point where I needed to know about interventionists, then I started finding people that I could talk to and reading more about that. So I was reading and talking and interviewing and writing at the same time.
Interesting, thank you.
There's a question over here.
Oh, I'm sorry I came in late. My pleasure to hear you. Two questions that I hope are related. The first may be too personal, but it comes from my context. And that's a question to you, Roxana, as to what your birth order is in your family of origin.
I'm the 4th of 5.
And older are boys or girls?
Both.
So you're a middle
I'm a middle, but I was the youngest for 7 years.
So middle only for a while, almost. And related to that, going back to the earlier part of the conversation, in which you were talking about the exquisite detail, which so characterizes to me your writing, or your writing. I first discovered you through I'm the affiliated person.
Oh, yes.
Okay, that,
Nice to see, yes. Thank you for coming.
this is a little, I'm sorry I'm late. You went from a week ago being one character and then becoming it quickly. Horrifying. So, but the other question is on the scene. Because before rendering that exquisite detail and choosing whether your character is primarily visual or oratory or what have you, or regular, all that stuff, you, at a very young age, saw. And was that a family trait? I mean, you saw. That was true also in the plot, which is why I'm saying that. Because you have to see, and many people, women in particular, need such interrupted lives. It requires a kind of presence.
It's a good question. I mean, in terms of visually seeing, you're talking about visually seeing, or are you talking about
taking
Perception.
whatever it is that where you focus and you really see and register, and then can translate it into language of your character, whatever. Not everybody sees.
well, it's partly my bent that I'm interested by people. I'm very interested by what people do. So that's a great interest of mine. So I want to know everything I can know about people. In terms of the visual aspects of it, I suppose that is a big part of my family. My father loved art, loved painting watercolors himself. So looking at things was important. That was just a part of the family culture. And in my mother's family, her father was a writer and a naturalist. So we were raised to look at birds, listen to sounds, tree frog, anything in the natural world. We were encouraged to absorb all that information and to treat it as very important. It was very significant. Oh, that's the first wood thrush. They're back. Listen to that wood thrush. So that became a very large part of the family culture, listening to the world, to the natural world, watching the natural world. And then the other, watching people, I don't know. That's just, maybe that's my own individual.
And the sound of words is that part of it too. I remember a 7th grade student many years ago, who didn't pass, not wanting to write something that had the word ocean in it because she preferred sea.
That's perfectly, it's a wonderful way to experience language. It should mean, the words themselves should have different presences in your mind. I was just talking to somebody, I have a piece that's going to be in Harper's in September, and I was doing the last changes with the editor yesterday, and she said, I'm going to draw your attention to some places where you have used repetition. And I said, fine. And she said she was working with a writer years ago, and she had said, you repeated this word here, and I'm assuming you don't want to. And he said, I do want to. It's incantatory. It's not repetition, it's incantatory. And she said, I always thought that was funny. And I said, why would you think that's funny? That's what writers do. He's using that word deliberately.
That's why she's an editor.
So there's the sense of every word having a presence in your mind, and the shape of it. Dilemma has 2 high parts and then a long low part. The sound of it is different from quandary. So every word should mean something different and should sound different and feel different in a sentence. And I think that is something that it's part of you. Although any teacher can encourage it and draw it out of students. So, I don't know. Is that an answer?
Yes, very.
I actually have a question.
Great.
We've talked a lot about what inspires you as a writer, but I'm sort of interested in also what throws you off. Especially when you talk about a novel like Cost, which you've written, in retrospect, it all seems to come together very well. But, to me it seems like when I write things, it's more of an uphill battle. So what sort of things really throw you off, and how do you overcome them?
Oh, good question. One I hate to talk about. It's one of the ways I describe writing, particularly a novel, is like being a mole and burrowing underground. I don't really know where I'm going because the books I write are character-driven, not plot-driven. So I don't even know if I'm headed north. It's really a bumbling process, and it involves a great deal of wasted effort. Sometimes I'll spend 3 months on a chapter and then realize that it actually doesn't have a part in the book and it has to go. It's slow and clumsy. So, and also with cost, I knew, as I say, I started out knowing that I had to do research on the history of neurosurgery in America and the physiological properties of Alzheimer's, and then to discover that I had to find out about everything about heroin was extremely daunting. And then to try to pull all the strands together. I mean, there were moments in cost when my husband can tell you, I would just say, I don't know if I can pull this off. I don't know that I can make the emotional urgency and keep the psychological complexity and maintain the technological precision in a way that balances everything and carries the book forward the way it's meant to carry. I mean, you really feel it's a juggling act, and you're walking on a tight wire, and you're carrying 15 different things, most of which you can't even see. So at that point, you are sort of flying blind. I'm mixing metaphors, the mole burrowing. It's very confusing and complicated, and it's easy to be thrown off. It's easy to say, or to feel I can't go. I don't see the way further. I don't know where to go. I don't know where this is going.
So when a character, following up on that question, which I think is really interesting and brings me back to cost, when a character suddenly appears to have a heroin problem and you are horrified, what makes you say, oh, I have to do this, as opposed to, no, I'm changing my character, or, this family drama is going to, yes, no, that's not the book I wanted to write, right? And so you keep referring to a process, which I completely believe in myself, of knowing what has to be. But how do you register that? And how do you deal with the ups and downs in the process of something that requires a kind of faith?
It's very hard to answer that. It does seem, I mean, when I start writing a novel, I don't have an outline, but what I do is I have this conflict, this issue, the question that I don't understand and that troubles me. And somehow I gather a group of characters and I get to know them very well. So I actually write little biographies so that I'm not going to make somebody the wrong age in different scenes, or blue eyes and brown eyes. But I have a very clear sense of that person, where he was born, where he grew up, where he went to school, what his parents are like, what the neighborhood looked like that he grew up in, so that person becomes very clear in my mind. And so I knew that Jack was a younger brother. I knew he was trouble, and he was sort of a problem. But then as the book reveals itself to me, I mean, when people say I write a first draft and then I go back and I change things, I can't imagine writing like that. I don't write a first draft. I write the book. And I write each chapter over and over and over for the sentences and for the way the words appear. But I will never go back and say, okay, in the 15th chapter I've learned that Jack is a thief, so I go back to the first chapter and put something in about his thieving. That's not the way the book has developed. That's not the way the character has appeared. And the thing is that as you write a book like this, the characters change because of what happens in the book. So that by the end, the characters are different because of their experiences. So that somebody who says, oh, I've just started this book, but I've already written the last scene, I think, you have no idea who the people are in the last scene. until you've written the whole book, and because they've been changing each other each time they interact. They've informed each other of new things, and the action has informed them. So you can't write the last scene until you have written the entire book. So so I forget your question.
How do you?
Okay, so how do I trust it? So it's just it's like watching an image come up in the darkroom. It just becomes, it's somehow like magic. It appears, and you have to trust that it's going to be a strong presence. But there is some part of this that I can't explain.
Try to combine an observation about what you were just saying and your comments earlier about perception and when you teach, because it seems to me that one of the real challenges in working with people who could write but don't automatically write, your 7th grade friend, is to show them how to access something that is completely natural to you. And part of that is perception. You were talking about the seeing. Part of it is, are you a seeing person? But part of it is you are a seeing person. What have you seen? What is there? And I think that involves tapping into and trusting the unconscious to some degree, which I at least find that a number of people have great difficulty doing. It is too frightening. I will read an essay. I'm sure you see this also when you're teaching. You can see the points where the person is backing off, and you know that you want to encourage them to go into those places. So how do you do that from a teaching perspective, using your own experience where it's natural, you have the instinct, you know how to observe and how to trust and how to press yourself through that process? How would you encourage somebody who doesn't quite know how to, that they see, how to trust, etc.?
When I teach, I use a series of exercises that I figured out myself that are pretty useful. I start off by saying, and I don't explain the exercises until they've done them. The first one is, and they're all only one page. The first one is write one page of dialogue, only dialogue. No, she walked to the window. No, he put on his coat. Only dialogue and 2 voices and a conflict. And with those constrictions, it's amazing what people will deliver. And I don't tell them beforehand, but then you read that and you say, what do we know about these people? How old are they? What sex are they? What's their relationship to each other? Do they have children? I mean, everything is revealed in this conflict. And conflict is what moves the story along. It's the emotional engine of the story. And what beginning writers often do is to try to take a long time in setting things up, clearing their throats, as editors would say. And this cuts that out. It's just the conflict. And those can be great and very revealing, and they just get right into it. And people mostly write about conflicts that are familiar to them, so they're ones they know a lot about, and they're often very revealing. So that's a great sort of way to jumpstart the process, and it relaxes people, and they see they can do it. And the voices are often wonderful that come out in that. And we talk about spoken voices, spoken language and written language, and having an ear for spoken language, for dialogue. And then I have them do a page of description of a place, and I say I want it to be informed by grief. So that they have to describe a scene, just a visual, just a tangible place, and they have to describe it through the lens of grief. So it's the words that they're going to choose that will deliver the sense of emotion. And then the next one is the same place informed by joy. So, and I've had wonderful responses to this. One of the best was a hospital waiting room, with both emotions. And a great one was a child's bedroom. And the one informed by grief was so powerful. The bed was pulled out from the wall, the rug was turned up, and the closet door was open. And on the closet floor, there were books thrown and open and just discarded. And in the wall, in the closet, halfway up the wall, was the mark. A fist had gone through it. And it was incredibly powerful, this scene of rage and disappointment and somehow abandonment. And then the same room informed by joy was this child's room with the bed, and on the bed were 2 kitchen chairs with a bedspread. So people get this, they enter into this sense of what can be delivered through just description of a place, nobody in them. So that's some of the way, and then I say, okay, now I want one page introducing a character. I want to see what that character looks like. I want them doing something. I want them, they can be talking, they can be doing some activity. I want to see where they are. And then depending on how long the course is, sometimes I'm teaching a short workshop. Sometimes that's all. Sometimes I have the character, one page of that character with a parent. And so by this time they've gotten into it, and so that interaction is always fruitful. And it goes on like that. So they're short pieces that allow you to get right into something. Instead of saying, write a short story, which is very daunting to somebody who doesn't know how to do it, it's get inside the characters, get inside the use of language. You can do it, and it's short.
Do you find that you have sort of a pattern where you'll write for a couple of hours every day, or you'll not write for 3 weeks and then write for 5 hours, or do you try to get structured about how you write?
I try to be structured. I try to write every day, and for me the best time is the first thing in the morning. When I'm starting a project, I can't write for very long. It's sort of 2 or 3 hours. Once I get towards the end of it, I can write all day, and then I need to sort of retreat somewhere where I really will not be bothered by the world. And there are different places that I can sort of bolt holes that I can go to get away. But in the earlier stages, that's not really useful because I don't know enough about what I'm doing. But my model, my hero, is John Updike, who wrote 1,200 words, 6 days a week, without exception.
Another question. Do you see gendered differences in your students?
In my students?
Yes. In terms of, saying, I think so often we can't think outside the dominant discourse. We maybe don't know how we're affected by the dominant discourse, but I always think of asking a man and a woman why they were in a poetry writing workshop, and the woman said, to take myself more seriously, and the man said, to find a wider audience for my work. And that is obviously a bad generalization, which hopefully does not hold, but I'm not sure. But I'm wondering about the implication of shaming messages. If you have exercises, because even people who self-select to go to a writing workshop, some of them haven't. They would not even reach for it. So, you know what I mean? Where they get to a certain point and they couldn't go into that place you mentioned.
Some of them
Or
can.
some voice comes in and says, well, what are you living in? That, or what about the children?
Well, it is self-selective, so that the people who I teach are people who have chosen to take that section of time and devote it to that. So I don't have people who are, I have lots of people who are feel uncomfortable and uncertain about whether or not they can write, but that's not a gender issue. So it's, I mean, what you say is certainly true, but at the point where I'm...
But certainly you have friends that are contemporaries who would if they could, but our society is so
everyone who comes up to
product-oriented.
me at any event tells me they would be a writer if they only had the time.
I do a workshop for take your own sweet time.
Okay. Did you have a question?
I think if you're a writer,
Can you speak up a little?
if you're a writer, I think you can't resist writing. Follow up on that sentence. But what do you do when you're writing a novel and you have a character character that is so vivid to you and so real and so alive and you've fallen in love with them, but this voice in the back of your head tells you that something crucial is going to happen to that child or a young adult, and do you step away back for a few days and then come back to it, or do you face it right on?
You mean the death of someone that you become engaged with?
It's imminent.
For-
At this point, and that's the way it's feeling to me.
For me, as a novel progresses, it's like a snowball. It accretes mass and potency and urgency, so that by the time something like that happens, I really don't have much control and I don't have any distance. So it's just something I'm in the middle of, and it's going. So I don't have a lot of distance. I don't have any distance.
I'm curious, when you finish a book, do you know what you made, or do you feel like, I don't know if people are going to love this book, hate this book, I had to do it, but I don't really know what it is, and then maybe a year or two later, you know what you made? I'm just curious if that's part of your, or you feel like you know the book when you
Well, knowing the book and knowing what other people are going to think about it are two different things. When I finish a book, it feels very sort of unformed. It's like a cake that hasn't really baked yet. It's still, in a friable state. And people have all sorts of different reactions. I mean, there are people who despise my books and post blogs about how much they hate them. So it's not as though I know what it is. It's a book that everyone loves. It's not a book that everyone loves. Some people love it, some people detest it. So I have to give it up, and if my editor loves it, that's really all I can hope for. And then she puts it into the world, and then another process starts. So I have to withdraw from it.
I mean, a lot of artists, it's like you make something and you could talk about the last piece that you did before that and be very cogent, right? And then you start talking about either what you're working on now or what you just finished, and you just go blah, 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 like, and then a year from then, you kind of like can talk about it, like, oh, I had to do this.
Right. That's a good one. I never talk about what I'm working on currently, because it is in such it's an inchoate state. I just don't have any, first of all, it would be damaging to talk about it because it sort of interrupts the process, but also I don't really know what it is yet. So yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Once a book has been out for a year, then I can talk about it in a much more confident way. Yeah.
There's a question over here, yes.
Again, I'm sorry. Back to John Upduke. I'm surprised he's your model, because that very need to write all the time means that very few of his characters are really any good. He had this one wonderful character, Rabbit Angstrom, and the rest of his novels are maybe very well written, but you feel that he's pushing himself, and I think he really shouldn't have done it. He's written too much. He's what the Russians call a graphomaniac. A graphomaniac. But it seems to me that I much more admire writers who either have an engine of creativity, like Philip Roth or Tolstoy. They needn't be as good as in one particular spot as John Updike, or who know when to leave it alone, written one or two good things and stopped.
Nobody knows when to leave it alone. That's not how writers think. But you have a very valid point about Updike, and I don't champion all his books by any means. I think a lot of them are not his best efforts. I think his best efforts are the Rabbit books and his short stories, and I think those are really great passages in American literature. The thing about writing a lot is, as O'Keeffe said, work makes work. If you write a lot, you will produce a lot. Updike has an astonishing body of work. He was a great intellectual presence and a beautiful, powerful writer. So he has created a presence in American letters through all those books. And you're right, a lot of them are not wonderful books by any means, but the ones that are not great are interesting. And he was and those are novels of ideas, and they haven't reached that transcendent place where ideas and emotions and intellect have equal power.
Exactly.
But there's still, I mean, it gives a writer presence to have written 50 books.
Do you think presence is important?
Unfortunately, in this era, yes.
Yes.
People are buying fewer and fewer books. They are reading fewer and fewer books. Publishers have less and less of a sense of what is good literature. They don't know what's, there are people who write commercial books with long words in them who are considered somehow good writers. And the publishing houses have been bought by people who only care about profit, and they're not really trying to get John Updike's first novel. They're trying to get the Nanny Diaries. So it's a very different world, and if you have created a body of work that commands attention, it's important to a writer too. So if you've written 3 fabulous books and you didn't win any prizes, you're nowhere.
But you don't think English lit profs and book clubs are more discriminating?
No, I don't. I think book clubs
doesn't do it.
will latch on to anything that won an award. They'll all be the kite runner.
I also think, just as an English lit prof, that we are far more powerfully affected by the market than we would like to think we are. Who publishes, what they publish, what they put in front of you, what they send out as a catalog. How you happen upon the gems is becoming more and more difficult because there are so many words out there. So I would agree with Roxana. And there's a question.
So I would love to know a gem or two that you're reading now or have just read that you recommend.
I will tell you the gems are very few and far between. One of my favorite, one of the things Karen said was how do you sort of regenerate your interest and your impetus. And a lot of writers that I know, and I myself, will reread books, just a page often, to get ourselves started. And one of my favorite books is, To the Lighthouse, but also The Hours by Michael Cunningham, who sort of mirrors Virginia Woolf. And if you haven't read that, it's a great, great book, I think. And that uses language in such a beautiful, luminous way, and also goes into this notion of the intersection of the domestic life and the larger world. For a long time I read John Cheever's journals and would just read a page or 2 of those because that allows you to enter into a world that is so immediate and so without, the emotional access is so immediate and so direct. There's just no entrance, there's no throat clearing. You're in his heart. And so that's a great way to remind yourself first thing in the morning of the possibilities of writing. Gems that I recommend, anything by Alice Munro, I would recommend. The new book by Jennifer Egan, The Visit from the Goon Squad, is a really interesting book. She's a beautiful writer. I was just talking about it to my daughter. I find it kind of cold. My daughter said it's not cold, so you can make that decision. But there aren't a lot of books that I admire. In fact, there's a strain of writing that I just don't find interesting at all, and that is this very kind of ironic, satiric, hip, cool presentation in which the reader is required to set up a huge emotional distance between herself and the characters, and the characters are all sort of vaguely mocked and derided for having emotions, and I find that really fruitless to read. So I find myself swimming against the current of a lot of American writing. Sue Miller, she's a wonderful writer. She just published a new book called the something Express. It's a Chicago train, Lake Shore Express or something like that. She's a wonderful writer.
I'm so glad you mentioned Alice Munro, who's, I think, the genius of all time. And I once went to a reading of hers in Canada, in Vancouver, where she read a story that she'd already published, and then she said, but it needn't have ended like that. And she gave another ending just as good. That was a thrilling moment.
With computers and tweeting, do you think young writing students have lost their ability to use language fully? No?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't tweet myself, but I mean, you can certainly write beautiful prose on a computer. There are other questions about what computers do, but I don't think they...
I guess it's the tweeting part, everything's short and abbreviated. And
I think there is something in Facebook, which I now am on, there's a limit to the number of words you can use. So it cuts down, there is an issue about whether or not students now are being encouraged to enter into that kind of deep place where you can read without distraction and in a way that allows you into a world that you have no other way of reaching. All I can say is it's deep, it's interior, it's quiet, and reading and not listening to something on your headphones and not being on the computer at the same time, but simply reading texts is something that everybody was required to do before there were computers, and now does less and less. I mean, reading on a Kindle and reading while you're doing 3 other things doesn't allow for that same absorption into the text that was possible before that. So I would wonder about that more than I would worry about tweeting.
And I'd also like to add that word limits for writers have existed far before Facebook, tweeting.
Right.
News writers or anybody who's ever written articles had to deal with a word limit.
A word limit, but the word limits on, you're absolutely right, but the word limits on those are so brief that they don't allow for anything profound, anything that, any movement. It's just a kind of it's a flash.
It's not meant to be profound in the same
No,
way a news article, or like, caption for a photograph in a news article. It's a different, sort of writing.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, part of that is recognizing what genre you're in, but I would agree that all the same desires still exist in the students, and that there are some forces that are suppressing those desires. And I would say, students are just a microcosm of the world, so all those desires continue to exist in people for profundity that can be accessed by reading, but there are more forces working against being able to have that experience. So you have to swim upstream a little bit to get that. Helen, you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I was just curious about your experience as a reader, and to what extent can you just entirely surrender to the process of the author and enter that world, and to what extent are you analyzing the craft of writing, or thinking, how would I teach this, or what works in this piece? Or I'm sure there's tension and you flip back and forth, but
It's a good question. A book I just finished last night is Middlemarch. So that's, and I read it first years ago and hated it. And so for years, anytime it comes up, and all the writers I know love it, and you love it, and everybody would say, oh, Middlemarch, and I said, oh, I just couldn't stand that disgusting Sabin and idiot Dodo. And person after person kept saying, well, why would you love it? It's so great. And then recently somebody said, but it's so funny. And I thought, I completely missed it. I have to go back. So I just finished it. Of course, now I love it. And it is funny. That's great. But so I don't read with any kind of critical eye. I'm completely uninterested in craft. In fact, I hate the word craft. I never use it. I never give a craft lecture.
sorry.
No. I forget. I just mean for myself. I'm a completely intuitive writer, as I say. I don't have a synopsis. It's a different process. I never think in those terms, and I don't even when I teach other people's work, which I love to do. I don't talk about craft in that technical way, because it's not something that is useful for me. And I was talking to another writer about a third writer who gives this craft lecture, and she was talking about writing a short story, and she was saying, now this opening passage is the ramp onto the story. And I said,
Engineering.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
but you
shouldn't
do talk about words and rhythms of words, like dilemma versus quandary. So there is something very precise about how you conceive of the process of writing.
the process. It's not the process; it's the product. And for me, it's the process. So I will make a decision about dilemma or quandary based on the other words in that sentence and how the rhythm is going. And I admire and I worship beautiful prose in other people. And when I teach Updike, for example, there's a beautiful short story called Separating that he wrote, which is just heartbreaking and exquisitely beautiful. And I will say, listen to this sentence, look at this sentence, look at how beautiful it is. I don't say let's construct, let's figure out where the verb is and how I don't care about that. I want, everybody should be able to write a good sentence. And I want you to admire, to put your head down in front of these sentences. And also, and I'll say how heartbreaking this is. And a lot of people complain about Updike in that story because the protagonist seems like him, and they say, but he's a monster. And I say, but he's the one telling you he's a monster. He's incredibly self-aware. So we talk about the psychology, but I don't talk about ramps. I don't talk about narrative arcs. I don't talk about. That's not the way, for me, writing works. For me, it's intuitive. The emotion is what drives it. The words are my tools, and it's a blundering process in which you worship the words and what they can do, and you just are struggling to make them create this glowing, radiant presence that you. I sense that.
I
This is where the ramp going on.
every one of you are as surprised and disappointed as I am that this hour has passed so quickly. But it has been incredibly rich. Thank you both. Thank you.